Welcome back to the Get Unstuck and On Target podcast. I'm Mike O'Neill with Bench Builders, and we work with companies, especially manufacturers, that want to grow their business, but they're struggling with people, process, or planning problems. Joining me today from the UK is AJ Saunders. AJ is a digital marketing consultant and SEO coach. AJ has been an SEO geek since 2014, and he's built hundreds of websites for clients in a wide range of industries. In the last decade, AJ has launched an ebook publishing company, a global e-commerce shop, and he has started a number of companies. Welcome, AJ.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here.
AJ, I think you and I first crossed paths through the Gurus Gather Live event. Does that sound right?
Right, yeah, indeed.
And in that conversation, what I just kind of learned is that there is some universality, if that's the right way of saying this,
Right,
with this topic. But SEO, that is the area that I would like us to kind of start our
perfect,
conversation.
perfect.
As you know, our listeners are business leaders. Many of them are business owners, and they probably know what SEO stands for.
Right.
But I want to spend our first part of this podcast. Tell me, SEO, it stands for
So it stands for search optimization.
Search Engine Optimization, and that's a real
Correct.
fancy word. What's it mean?
So how I see SEO is I see we're trying to encourage Google to favor our website over other websites because of the content that we can provide and the answers we can help the end user with is better than everything else out there.
Mm-hmm.
So if you imagine you're selling, say, tractors, right? And they deal with a lot of manufacturers, so they probably are buying, tractors and forklifts, right?
Yes.
For me as a consultant, I want to help that business sell more tractors or more forklifts by making them really attractive to Google. And the way we do that is by having pages and posts that are built out and really discuss the topic in depth, so they get seen as the expert within their industry. But also they're doing it in a unique, incredible way. So they're not republishing the same old material. They're not talking about things in the same way. They're thinking about different ways of saying a topic. And that's how I see SEO. So I don't see it as this dark art. I don't see it as something that's very mystical or very highfalutin. I just see it as another way to market your business that is a very succinct marketing channel that just requires a lot of time, effort, and patience.
You know, you started by talking about you're trying to drive traffic to your website.
Correct.
In your opinion, in today's climate, how essential is a website?
So for me, websites are critically important, but you're much better to have a single page website that's up to date than to have a website that's 3,000 pages and completely chaotic and completely out of date.
Mm-hmm.
And so I encourage people I encourage my clients to really think about how they can use their verticals, so their website, to educate, to engage, and to romance their prospective clients.
You know, you made educate as the first thing. You want to
Correct.
educate
Yeah.
the visitor.
Yeah.
Um, you all used three terms. Educate was the
Correct.
first one. What were the other two?
The other two were engage
Yes.
and then romance.
Ah, so tell me a little bit more. When educate, I think I get that.
Right.
Engage. What does engagement mean?
So for me, if we sit here and talk about processes and we talk about people and we talk about people strategy, because I know that's kind of what you spent your 20-year, 30-year career on, right?
Yes.
You probably have some really engaging thoughts that you could say in a very well educational thoughts you can say in a very engaging way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just about saying how can I talk to my target person like I was saying at a conference or over coffee or over a beer in my case in the UK, right? And so, how can we say something in a really, really dynamic, personal way, like we were having a conversation with that person, but do it in, say, either video format, like we're doing here with this podcast, or do it, in audio, or do it in kind of written, kind of a blog post or a page on your website. And so, there are lots of, I imagine you find this all the time with manufacturers. Manufacturers generally have good websites that are very, very poorly written
Hmm.
because they're written by people who are technical and they aren't written to be engaging. And so they're educational, don't get me wrong, but they're not engaging. And so, yeah, so I think, I always call it, the coffee or the beer test. Would you speak in that way if you were meeting your friend for coffee or for a beer or for a meal? And how would that, if you were sat there reading it as the, opposing person, as the person at the end, how would that actually look to you? And so that to me is the education and the engaging part. The
Yes.
romance part is I want people to spend as long as possible on my website because I know from a conversion point of view, if somebody comes and reads one article, agrees with half of it, and goes back to Google, they're never going to come back. Whereas if somebody's got to their third or fourth article, they're more likely to take that. They're more likely to click on that CTA, the call to action that I've laid out for them. So whether it be book a call, take a quiz, download a PDF, whatever. And so for me, one of the key metrics that I talk about with every client that I have is how can we increase time on the site, time on the website, because I know that once people hit kind of the 3, 4, 5 minute mark, they're really engaging with what you've written and they're really engaging with you as a brand. And then it becomes easy for you to either catch their email address to then retarget them, in terms of the email sequence. You then might be able to do something like remarketing, which is where you show an ad from your website on different websites they go to. So, news websites, Facebook, etc. But you have to have that initial engagement. And you have to do something that encourages them to keep the interest up. And I call it romancing because I don't want somebody to. Well, I know somebody isn't going to come to a website and read one post and think I'm sold. It just doesn't work like that, And I was recently in Romania, and one of my contacts, she was saying to me, it usually takes me 2 or 3 conversations for me to make the sale. And I was like, great, you got some data. Obviously, being a bit of a data nerd, but it's that kind of thing. If you realize it's going to take a couple of touch points, and in marketing kind of parlance, we talk about kind of 7 or 8 touch points. I wouldn't. I don't. I'm agnostic to that number. I just think the more touch points we can have, the more likely they are to be romanced and to believe that you are the solution, not a solution to your problem. The more likely they are to take the action that you've specified to move towards that next step.
So, AJ, you kind of explain in a way that I think I understood,
Right.
and that is that the role of a website is at least threefold.
Right.
One is to educate the visitor.
Correct.
Two, to engage the visitor, and that is that when they come to your website, that they find that the content compelling,
Yeah.
that they are wanting more.
Yeah.
And then the third you called kind of romancing.
Yeah. Right.
And you said something a moment ago that kind of caught my attention, and that
Okay.
is, in practical terms, when someone goes to a website, we know that they have tracking capability,
Correct.
but the person who owns that website, they may not know who is actually visiting that website. And you made a comment about that if you have something that is downloadable and they provide a email address to
Yeah.
in fact download, then you're in a position to know who visited,
Yeah.
and that could give you an opportunity to do follow-up with that
Absolutely.
website visitor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the examples that come immediately to mind, you mentioned a couple of those things, but it sounds as if they come to the website, they find it educational,
Yeah.
they've begun to engage. The
Yeah.
longer on the website, in your opinion, the better.
Yeah.
But what is it
Absolutely.
about given an email address that people are sometimes hesitant to do?
Right. So when we think of digital marketing strategy, we think of three different types of media. So we think of owned, paid, and then user, right?
Mm-hmm.
So owner things like our websites, our content, our contact book, our email address list, and those are things that we can have a direct impact on without there's sweat equity involved, right? So we have to do the work, but there's no money involved. There is obviously because everything has a cost. So that's owned, right? Paid channels are things like running adverts, so whether that's running adverts on Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, whatever, right? TikTok. And then you have the user content, which is things like when somebody gives you an award or somebody writes a nice testimonial for you on, say, LinkedIn or on a third party site. And so you can't really control the user stuff. You know, of course, you kind of can because you can do things like have a testimonial strategy where you offer a testimonial after you've delivered good work and the client's happy. But a lot of the kind of the user kind of media you can't do anything with. So I tend to focus on how can we get the other two channels working and working well. And so for me, the reason that I love email so much is emails, people generally stick to emails like they stick to their bank, right? They don't change. Number one. Number two, emails are there's even though there's changing privacy and we're having more and more debates about privacy in general, and I think that is a good thing, and I think we should be doing more on privacy. Once you have someone's email address, unless they tell you to leave them alone, you have that direct channel of communication with them. It can't be affected by some algorithm updates. One of the things that I constantly talk to people about is, has Facebook changed their algorithm this week? Has Google changed their algorithm? And actually, I wrote something on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago where I put, if you're if you're getting knocked by every Google update, your strategy is wrong, and you're implementing tactics. You're not implementing a strategy that is long term. And we can get into that, and that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so I feel that email is still a really, really vital marketing channel because you have that direct communication with somebody until they either die or they say no more. And so for me, you're immune from a lot of the ills that we suffer as digital marketers with, that allows you to connect directly with the customer.
I got you. So having an email address is very, very important because
Absolutely.
the reasons you've kind of just mentioned.
Yeah.
We started this conversation around the topic of search engine optimization,
Correct.
and you use another term, organic search, and
Right.
that is, we all know that we can pay to have
Yes.
our website come up when someone goes in and types in certain words.
Right.
I believe what we're talking about now is something different than that right now, and that is you want people to find your website,
Mm.
but you want to do it in a way that, I use the term organic. I don't know if that's the proper
Yeah.
term,
Yeah. That's yeah.
but search engine optimization, if you're trying to run your business, trying to keep up with all this can be a little bit overwhelming. When you put it in language for a business owner to really understand,
Yeah.
what is SEO?
So for me, for me, SEO is just trying to get organic visitors from Google or Bing that help them answer a question, right? And so the fundamental strategy has not changed since Google existed in 1999, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all you're trying to do is you're trying to match what the user's problem is with a solution that you can provide for them.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's selling them a tractor, whether that's helping them dog train, whether that's buying wine, whatever. And so SEO is just the practice of making your website as attractive as possible to Google, so that you get as high onto that first page as high up on that first page as possible, so that you can connect and you can help people in that way. And yeah, you're right. You can skip the queue and get to the top by paying, but in some verticals that's incredibly expensive to do. And so yeah, so then the strategy becomes how can we build out pages and posts that make sense for what the client avatar that we're trying to target actually makes sense. And again, I know you're a big strategy guy, and I know this will make a lot of sense to you, but that to me is what I practice every day. Both in terms of digital marketing, into the organic search, SEO, is literally just how can I serve my avatar the best, better than my competition, and do it in a way that educates, engages, and romances them.
Yes,
Yeah,
you are right. Strategy is an area that we help businesses with, not
yeah,
only developing the strategy, but perhaps more emphasis is on execution of that
right,
strategy.
right,
Now we're talking about a marketing strategy.
yeah.
And did I hear you correctly? Was Google founded in 1999?
I believe so. I think it was 98, 99. Yeah,
My goodness. So let's talk about marketing strategy
sure.
and differentiating a digital marketing strategy from, say, marketing tactics or campaign.
Right.
Help us understand the difference.
Sure. So how I think of it is I think a strategy is the overarching plan.
Hmm.
So it's who you can help, what game you're playing, and how can you win at that game.
Mm.
So it's no different from general business strategy, right? So you, for me, I set the strategy for say a year, 2, 3, maybe even 5 years, right? And the strategy doesn't change because the market doesn't shift that frequently. For argument's sake, right? The tactics, are the things are the action steps we're going to take to reach that customer. And so that it's not a strategic element of our strategy, right? It's a tactical element of our strategy. And so it's the next step down. It's the how, it's not the why. And then I then think, so that's tactics. I then think of marketing campaigns as a defined event. So you might decide that you're going to run a tactic for say 6 months, and after those 6 months, you're going to analyze what's happened and how it fits back in with your overarching strategy. And so that becomes a defined event where you're committed to doing an activity for a set period, and you're going to set KPIs, you're going to set a desired outcome, or you're going to set a hypothesis for that campaign. And so then that ties together the strategy and the tactics in a very neat little bundle because you're just doing it for a set period and you have an idea and you have a hypothesis of what the outcome could be. And so that's how I think of strategy, tactics, and campaigns. And so, and I guess this is a frustration you do all the time. Lots of people talk about strategy when they talk about tactics. They're
Hmm.
talking about the action steps. And so there's lots of people that will talk about digital marketing strategies when it's not. They're talking about digital marketing tactics. And for me, the strategy doesn't change. The tactics do. The tactics will evolve depending on how best you feel that you're able to reach your target avatar, your target customer, based on the data and the information and the feedback that you get at each point. And so that's constantly evolving, right?
That it is. And you use this term twice, but I want to make sure that our
Sure.
listeners know avatar.
Avatar.
What is an avatar?
Sure. So it's much easier if you're trying to do marketing or you're trying to do branding. If you're talking to a type of person, so if I was to use you as an example for a second, you don't mind if that's okay.
You're not going to give me a choice, are you?
I'm not sorry. I would apologize, but I won't.
Please feel free to.
Okay, so if I was trying to reach southern gentlemen in their mid 50s, who run consultancy businesses, I would want to spend, probably a couple of hours just picking your brain and trying to observe how you talk, what language you use. I try and throw some curveballs in there so to understand what didn't resonate with you, so that I can go right. I should never use that phrase,
Hmm.
right? And so that to me is building a really strong avatar of who your customer is and what's going to help them resonate with you. So I can give you another example. So a great friend of mine called Claire is this really loud Scottish woman who I absolutely adore, but she uses a lot of slang, a lot of swear words, and she uses a lot of very, very meme like language where that the joke's implied, it's not obvious.
Yes.
Because she's grown up like I have, watching a lot of like The Office and those types of kind of humor, where it's the humor's implied, it's not. It's the awkwardness, right? And so what I'm encouraging Claire, and what Claire is getting better at, and what she's really really great at, and so we're just tweaking it together, is literally just displaying her personality in her marketing. Because I know, once she gets rid of all of her hang-ups, all her head trash about having to market in a certain way, she flies. Because the moment you talk to her and you realize she's a human being, she's really funny, she's really clever, and she uses all this weird terminology that you don't quite understand. People get her, right? And the people that don't get her, great. There's more opportunities in the marketplace to go hire somebody else who may be a better fit for them. And so for me, that is what the avatar is. It's trying to find people that you can resonate with, but also can resonate with you, and how you then can speak to them, and how you might not want to speak to them, and how the overlap between how you want to speak to and how you don't want to speak to them versus how they want to be spoken to and how they don't want to be spoken to, and hopefully get a nice overlap. And that's where the avatar and your business kind of meets. If that does that all make sense?
It does make sense. Yes, it does.
That is a high level strategy. That's not.
I had to chuckle myself though, and that is, here in the States, we thought that The Office is a U.S. Product, and we know that we stole that from Britain, and the British kind of dry wit is something that us Yanks sometimes don't get it.
Right.
But you've shared with us how important it is, if you're a business owner, to really understand the client that you're trying to target. And what you're encouraging us is, it's not a superficial understanding. It's kind of a deep dive. It's to not only be able to visualize what that person looks like, but how they act, how they think, the phrasing that they use, what things interest them outside of. Is the more complete your understanding is of who is the decision maker for your product or service, the better you're going to be at targeting and improving your effectiveness on people finding you on your website, be engaged by that, and over time perhaps even be romanced by the process. AJ, we have business owners listening to this. We have business leaders listening to this, and we started with SEO, and for those who kind of said, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to go there," but we've talked about how fundamentally it is to at least understand the concept. AJ, what do you find that we oftentimes get wrong when it comes to marketing?
Sure. So a few things. So I think people misunderstand who they're targeting. And I think that they think, well, they either go super niche, so they go, well, I can help, pregnant mothers with one leg who run yoga facilities, right? Just to be absurd, because you'll hopefully get that example.
That's very specific.
That is very specific. Where, or they go, well, I just help, yoga teachers. And it's like, okay, right, there's multiple different types of yoga, which one do you feel the most that you can resonate with, and you feel you have the biggest impacts? And so I think if we're talking about marketing in general, I think I think it's, how do you define who you're targeting is super important. Then I think the next thing is, and I talk to clients all the time about this, and prospect clients all the time. I then say, so what is your strategy and what are your KPIs, key performance indicators, right? And lots of people go, well, we have a website. Okay, and so for me, I then say, okay, right, so if every visitor has a dollar amount that they're willing to spend, that they're going to give you as in revenue, how many do you need to reach the expectation of that marketing channel? How long are they spending on each site? What is your content strategy? What is your content plan? And how does that actually feed into those other two numbers? because they're all connected, those three numbers. And so for me, yeah, it's really, really important to sit here and to say, get really clear on who you're targeting, get really clear on what KPIs you're measuring and how you're measuring them. And to me, the great thing about KPIs is I just see them as like a health check, right? So every morning we get up and we go, how do we feel? Do I feel good? Do I feel bad? Do I want to go to bed, right? In some cases. KPIs to me are like that. It literally is, have I hit that marker, or have I not hit that marker, or is there room to improve, right?
Yes.
And so that's how I see KPIs. So KPIs are not going to define your livelihood essentially, but they will help you make that qualitative decision of, are we on the right track? Because if we're not on the right track, then we can change tactics, or we can rejig campaigns. Whereas if our KPIs are moving in the right direction, or we're exceeding them, then we know that our plan and our strategy has worked.
And it may be that the answer to the question I'm about to ask is somewhat contained into what you just said.
Sure.
But AJ, can you reflect on a situation where perhaps either you or a client got stuck? And what did it take to get unstuck?
Sure. So with some of my clients, I spend a lot of time especially when I'm doing coaching with clients, I spend a lot of time doing things like making checklists for them so that they actually have SOPs, standard operating procedures. But I also spend quite a lot of time doing things like just sorting them out mentally. So I recently finished with a client, and about 3 weeks ago we had a session, and I said, okay, you've gone so far, and you now have the knowledge to then build out what you're trying to do in terms of your web presence. I said, but you're still in a chaotic mess. So one thing you can do is you can go, well, the challenge is too great. We're going to go back to bed, right?
Yes.
I use some curse language at that point, which I'm going to refrain from using now. But right, so I said, but that could be one strategy, right? And so I went through probably four or five different options that we could do, and a lot of that is not trying to encourage them and teach them something new, but to encourage them to think outside their own reality at the moment, and to really get them to think, how can I do something that moves me towards the goal and deal with the overwhelm that I'm currently feeling? And so in their case, they came up to me the next week and said, right, we think the best plan for us going forward is to do X and Y. And I went, great. How can I help you implement that better? Right?
Yes.
And so they actually chose two options, right, of my strategy plan, right? And so that's great. And then it becomes the whole hour that I spend getting them unstuck is literally just saying, right, what options do you think you have? Right, here's the options that I think you might have. How does that actually then work out, in reality? Because we can sit here and we can plan until for the rest of the month, but unless you have the next action step, you're not going to get anywhere. I can think of a story that happened this week. So I've got a long-term client, and she was saying to me, I just feel overwhelmed at the moment with all these things that are happening. And I said, okay, right, here are the four things that I suggest that you do, right? And so I said the first one will upset you, and I said, I'd encourage you to go just take the rest of the week off and do nothing. So if you have emails to check to keep business going and that kind of thing, do that, of course, but just relax, because at the moment you're stressed, and therefore you're not making poor decisions, but you're not making the best decision that you can in your circumstances. So I was just like, go take a couple of days off. Go and work out what a client is paying you for the amount of work that you're doing, and see if there's a mismatch in that in that dollar amount. Because obviously, if you're spending 20 hours of your life doing something that the client's paying $100 for it, you either need to go back and negotiate and say, well, actually, you're getting $400 of value, but I'll charge you $300 for that. Or you got to say, well, actually, I've got to decrease what I'm doing for you to fit within your budget, to fit within the time specifications that I have within that dollar amount, right?
Yes.
And so there are other things, obviously, that we talked about that, I'm not going to go into. But yeah, so... But I know by the end of that session, she looked far happier, far more relieved. And it was literally me just saying, right, these are the options. These are what I think you could do. Here's a dozen questions that you can go away and think about. But what is that first step that you're going to take? And how can I help you take that first step?
That was a great example of
Thank
how
you.
you helped, and it was timely because it's something that you did somewhat recently.
Yeah.
AJ, we've covered a lot of
We have
topics
indeed.
in this conversation. So, as you kind of reflect on our time together, what do you want our listeners to have as takeaways?
Sure. So think of digital marketing as just another marketing channel. Think about how you can educate, engage, and romance your potential clients. Think about how you can move them closer to taking the action that you want them to do. And think about how you can engage them via email on a long term basis.
Excellent.
I think that kind of covers what we talked about in broad strokes.
Because we've covered things in broad strokes, there may be folks out there who say, I want to learn a little more about what it is AJ is sharing. What's
Yeah,
the
please.
best way for our listeners to connect with you?
So sure. So you can go to ajsdigitalgroup.com, and I've got a regularly updated blog there, which people can go and have a look at and go read. You can book a free 50-minute discovery call with me if you just have a question or a couple of questions that you want answered. So that's cool. You can go and book a what I call a VIP session, which is a 2 hour $500 session where you literally can ask me whatever you want to do about digital marketing, and I will sit and I'll be honest, I'll be open, and I will answer you. And so, if you're a small business that's struggling with digital and you don't have anyone to turn to, those 2 hours could change your business, change your life. And yeah, and all of that details is on the website. You can find out what I'm doing in terms of services, in terms of coaching, in terms of courses that I sell. It's all on the website.
I have your website open as we're recording
Ah,
this.
lovely.
So let me repeat that. The name of the website is AJS Digital Group. And I've been speaking with AJ Saunders, Saunders. I know that we're connected on LinkedIn
Correct.
as well. AJ, thank you for sharing your insights with me and our listeners today.
Thank you for having me. This has been an absolute blast. I've had such a good time. Seriously, it's been amazing.
All right. I'm glad you have, and I trust that the folks who've been listening have learned a great deal. I
Hopefully.
also want to thank our listeners for joining us today. We upload the latest episode every Thursday to all the major platforms, including Apple and Spotify. So if you, like me, have enjoyed this episode with AJ, please subscribe. I opened the podcast with a question somewhat along these lines, but are you trying to grow your business and you want to make sure that you got the right people, process, and planning systems in place so that you can grow smoothly? If yes, let's talk. You can go to our website, bench-builders.com, or you may find it even easier to remember. Just go type in unstuck.show and you can schedule a call. We're going to talk about your growth goals and we'll explore some practical steps that you can take now to make sure that that growth, in fact, happens. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope you have picked up on some tips from AJ that will help you get unstuck and on target. Until next time.